Alright, greetings everyone. Today I'm here to repeat the claim that gun control reduces the amount of deaths by firearm in the United States. My opponent's supporting point 1 is that gun control laws would reduce gun deaths. Point 2, the use of a firearm as protection is much more rare than the use of a firearm to inflict harm. And 3, gun control has proven to work in decreasing violence. On to point 1. Well, a general problem with the statement that gun control laws would reduce gun deaths is that the presenter did not specify which type of laws would reduce gun deaths. Does he mean laws which constitute stricter background checks or regulate the sale of ammunition and firearm magazines? Now, my statement to refute this claim is that gun control laws will not reduce deaths due to some uncontrollable factors such as suicide and violence. The evidence that my opponent used to support his claim is that in the United States, 2/3 of 7,900 deaths in 1981 involved arguments and brawls were caused by guns. Well, in reality, this statistic does not truly demonstrate the true motive for further imposing gun control on law-abiding citizens. After analyzing the presenter's statistic, 2/3 of 7,900 is approximately 5,266. Now, according to the Pew Research Center statistics table, all firearm deaths total by gender from 1981 to 2010, in 1981 specifically, there were a total of 34,050 deaths by firearms in the U.S. Out of the 34,050 deaths, 16,139 were caused by suicide. In other words, in the broader scope of things, the more significant issue at hand is not the small percentage of people getting involved in brawls, as the statistic claims, but rather the availability of access to mental health facilities when people need them the most. Therefore, implementing more gun control laws would unfortunately not be successful in lowering deaths due to the fact suicidal individuals will not stop themselves from taking their own life in the absence of a gun, but rather seek for other alternative methods to seize life. In fact, according to a study conducted by Procon.org, countries which have low gun ownership and a lot of gun restrictions have some of the world's highest suicide rates. For instance, Lithuania, which has a near 0.7 guns per 100 people, has a 45.06 suicides per 100,000 people. While on the other hand, the United States, which has 88.8 guns per 100 people, only has 12.3 suicides per 100,000 people. Similar statistics are seen in countries with low gun ownership such as Japan and Korea. Now on to my opponent's supporting point 2, is that the use of a firearm as protection is much more rare than the use of a firearm to inflict harm. Well, my claim to refute this is that states with lower gun control have less violent crime. The evidence that my opponent used to support the claim that the use of a firearm as protection is much more rare than the use of a firearm to inflict harm is that of the 29,618,300 violent crimes committed between 2007 and 2011, 0.79% of victims, which is approximately, according to a statistic, 235,700 people protected themselves with the threat or use of a firearm. Now, while this statistic may be partially correct, according to John R. Locke Jr., PhD, said, states with the largest increases in gun ownership also have the largest drops in violent crime. The effect on shall issue concealed gun laws on these crimes, where 2 or more people of multiple victim shootings declined by 84%, deaths from these shootings plummeted on average by 90%, and injuries by 82%. And also, a study by Mark Gaius found that between 1980 and 2009, assault weapons bans did not significantly affect murder rates at the state level, and states with restrictions on carrying of concealed weapons had higher gun-related murders. Now, my opponent's supporting point 3 is that gun control has proven to work in decreasing violence. His evidence used to support this is that Australia, which had 13 mass shootings in the 18-year period from 1979 to 1996, but none in the succeeding 19 years is worth examining. Well, My refuting claim for this is that while it is true that shootings have gone down, that does not necessarily translate to a decrease in violence. Even though the mass shootings have stopped in Australia, once strict gun laws were imposed and citizens had to surrender their weapons to the government, the percentage of people killed by stabbings has increased from 30 to 41%. So essentially, it's just a transfer of statistics from people getting killed by guns to people getting stabbed. And well, and my conclusion for this rebuttal is that in conclusion, even though gun control is advocated with good heart, it is quixotic given the wide range of uncontrollable factors such as suicide and crime. Thank you for your time.
Give it to somebody who says quixotic.
I was just going to say, you know, that's a nice word to throw in there at the end.
You definitely did better than when you were practicing this morning. You definitely improved.
Thank you.
Maybe that's like top baby names for 2016.
Are you winning? What are you taking?
Nothing wrong with being quixotic. You know who Don Quixote is?
Yes.
Don Quixote, charging at the windmills kind of thing. The idea of being quixotic means that you're chasing a stupid ideal and tilted windmills, basically. How smart. I should.
Look at the big brain on that guy.
Mike, the big brain guy.
You should see me do it sober.
If you're intoxicated, I have to ask you to leave.
Okay.
He's not heckling yet, so I think he's okay.
All right, Octavio, all of the structural stuff is fine. On the first point, you make a big argument about the suicide issue and trying to diminish the significance of the advocate's claim there. I think that you've got a good argument suggesting that suicides would not diminish, that there's a likelihood that they would continue. I don't know, though, that that automatically addresses some of the arguments that the advocate is making based on other kinds of points. And I think that there might be some other issues to talk about on those points, but they don't really come up. There might be a little bit of an application on your third point where you're talking about, they substitute one weapon for another in those particular situations. So if we're talking about, the brawls and fights and those sorts of things, where the idea that somebody couldn't be killed in a bar fight or in a domestic dispute, something like that, seems like it's perhaps not realistic. And if you provided some examples, for instance, of people who got into a domestic dispute and deaths occurred where no gun was involved, that would be, pretty useful. And I'm sure that there are plenty of examples of those kinds of things, unfortunately, that we can look at. Like 4 or 5 years ago, we had a guy up in our neighborhood who basically drove his car into his house and opened up all the gas lines and blew the whole place up, taking himself and his wife with him, and it's like, okay, you get pretty irritated, that sort of thing, and it didn't really involve a gun in that situation. So, I mean, some examples like that, to suggest that the idea that the gun is the instigator or the source of the problem, I think you could diminish that. But I do think that you kind of reduce the other risks quite a bit with your argument about the suicide point. The self-protection issue, I think you have an interesting response to. You do seem to accept the calculation that the advocate presents, that it's a relatively small number. However, you kind of go the other direction and suggest that the gun ownership really has reduced the amount of crime. So I think that that's a good counterclaim on that point. The idea that you have to use the gun to defend yourself and not just the ownership of the gun having an impact, I think that's the way you want to explain it and say, to protect yourself doesn't necessarily mean that you have to wave a gun at somebody who broke into your house. The idea that you might have a gun keeps people from coming into your house in the first place. And that's the way that I think you want to kind of contextualize the argument that you're making, because that's really the response that applies there. And then I think you've got an interesting statistic on the Australia case that suggests, that we really just have shifted from one mode of death to another. Maybe we don't get the mass killings, but I don't know what the numbers are on deaths in Australia. So it sounds like it's an increase in the percentage. That definitely sounds like it's accurate, but I don't know, like when it comes to deaths, if that resulted in a greater number of deaths. Do we have more deaths in Australia now than we did before, and they're all by knife? It's a reasonable press, and I thought that was okay. All right.
Everything in Australia is a fault to kill.